My name is Janelle Reddig, and I am a resident of Iowa City in Johnson County, and with my spouse, Robin Butler, who's back there in a Lambda Legal shirt, we played a small part in marriage equality in Iowa. And I'll tell you that Tom and Marc Hansen are the authors here, Tom Witosky and Marc Hansen. Between them, they have 63 years, 63 years of writing for the Des Moines Register. And so when we heard they were going to do this book, we were very excited because I think it's really important for us to recognize our history and how Iowa's role in that history is really important. When we started this journey on marriage equality, we didn't know how it would turn out, and we had no idea where it would end up and whether or not anyone would believe us. But the unique thing is that Iowa has two parts in its constitution: equal protection and then a second provision called laws uniform. And when I had read the Constitution and other people had read the Constitution, we realized that that was rather unique and made Iowa a very good position to do marriage equality. But before that could happen, we had to win civil rights for sexual orientation and gender identity, and we had to fight off a constitutional amendment, and we had to convince the national partners that Iowa was a good place to invest their next opportunity. When Iowa came down for marriage equality, I think that the people who knew Iowa's history and knew our Constitution and knew our Supreme Court rulings of the past weren't that surprised. The entire rest of the country, I think, was shocked. And so Tom and Marc have, in the greatest oral tradition of oral history, taken the stories of dozens and dozens of ordinary Iowans who decided to stand up and say, enough, I want to be equal and I'm willing to do something about it. And ordinary Iowans who found a lawyer who believed in us. And that lawyer was Camilla Taylor with Lambda Legal. This would not have been possible without Camilla Taylor and Lambda Legal. And the story begins long before that and decades before that. But what's very clear is the turning point is when Lambda Legal said, we believe in you, we believe in Iowa, we believe in Iowans, and we know we can do this. This is an extraordinary book, and one that I'll have to tell you that I was apprehensive about, because it's my story, and it's Jen and Don's story, and it's my spouse's Robin's story, and it's thousands of Iowans' story, and it takes a little bit of trust to put that in the hands of someone, and you wonder if they can tell your story and represent the good, bad, and indifferent without making you all look like fools. Tom and Marc have done an amazing job, and it tells the story of people like Jen and Don Bobrowski and McKinley and Bree, who have now all grown up. McKinley is working and Bree is in a softball tournament. So it used to be we never came to one of these events without them, but as their family has grown, we don't get to see them very much. I hope that you will enjoy this presentation. I hope you will buy lots of these books and give them to everyone you know. They make great Christmas presents. I think the guys are willing to sign them for you, and Jen and Don also. And enjoy our part in history, and make sure that you know that our part in history is still fragile. And a Supreme Court ruling is pending any day, and we need that final chapter of this book to come into play. And so as we all sit around with upset stomachs today awaiting that ruling, know that Iowa's part in history is a part of that story that hopefully will end in the next week or so. So enjoy this reading. Thank you.
Thank you, Janelle. I appreciate those kind words, and I know Marc does too. If you don't know, I'm Tom Witosky, and Marc Hansen is is the co-author of the book. We hesitate to say partner because sometimes that could get misinterpreted. It's already been misinterpreted a couple of times, but we're sort of new to this procedure of book readings and book events and that type of thing. So, and in some ways it seems sort of odd for me to stand up here and read a book and tell you what's in it when really what we want you to do is buy it and read it yourselves. But we really do appreciate the invitation. It coincided with the Pride celebration. Those celebrations are getting bigger and bigger all the time, and we had a good time yesterday, and we've been looking forward to this talk for quite some time. I thought, with the help of one of Mark's sons, Evan, who is the technology whiz behind us, we've put together an 8-minute video that will take you down memory lane. Some of this is going to be good, some of this is going to be bad, but for the most part, it is something that I think helps set the tone. And let me... It's a happy ending. And there is a happy ending.
Now, we're going on another liberal topic, and that's the ruling in Iowa. The Iowa Supreme Court has what I view to be a very, very important rule. They're saying that same-sex unions are allowed. In fact, same-sex marriages are allowed, and that it is unconstitutional to discriminate against same-sex couples in the state of Iowa. This is the final word in Iowa on it, so now we will have, this will be the third state, along with Connecticut and Massachusetts, to allow same-sex marriages. Let me read you a quote from the decision. They were unanimous and quite strong. Quote, "We are firmly convinced that the exclusion of gay and lesbian people from the institution of civil marriage does not substantially further any important governmental objective. The legislature has excluded a historically disfavored class of persons from a supremely important civil institution without a constitutionally sufficient justification." So they were not kidding around. They weren't confused as to which way to go. They weren't torn on the matter. They said this is a clear constitutional violation. Now, Ben, I think this is really important because it's in the heartland. And it is, in my opinion, the tipping point, and here we go. It's going to sweep the country.
We won. It is unanimous. You're getting married very soon. The decision was effective on Monday. In a unanimous ruling today, the Iowa Supreme Court affirmed the lower court ruling ordering issuance of marriage registers to same-sex couples. Today, Iowa once again took its place in the vanguard of the civil rights struggle, and we couldn't be more proud or honored to be part of this history. We'd like to thank our brave plaintiffs and their families.
Get married, live happily ever after. Live the American dream.
Thank you.
It appears that the Iowa Supreme Court is likening homosexual behavior to disallowing homosexual marriage is akin to slavery and segregation. It's similar to disallowing women the right to vote. Essentially says there is no difference between heterosexuality and homosexuality. Says that homosexual behavior is a fundamental right, and that sexual orientation and homosexual behavior is immutable, cannot be changed. Even though there, as we said yesterday, Reverend, there are thousands of people who have given up homosexual behavior and consider themselves heterosexual and behave that way now. The court has disagreed that those people exist. And apparently the court believes that there is no important state objective to having marriage be only between a man and a woman. And I would cite specifically my greatest concern is that by force of law, now every school child in every state school in Iowa, by force of law, will be forced to be taught that homosexual behavior is the equivalent of heterosexual behavior.
They're celebrating a history-making election in the state of Iowa. For the first time ever, voters booted out 3 Iowa Supreme Court justices, Chief Justice Marcia Turnus and her Associate Justices Michael Streit and David Baker. Former Republican candidate for governor Bob Vanderplatz heads the Iowa for Freedom group that organized the ouster.
I believe this will be a resounding victory, and I think this is a historic moment in the state of Iowa.
The Iowa Supreme Court unanimously ruled to legalize same-sex marriage last year. That upset many Iowans, and they showed their anger at the voting booth.
The people of Iowa stood up in record number today. They stood up for freedom by voting no against activist court.
I want to thank you for the unwavering love and support you extended to me from the day we issued our decision in Varnum, through the dark days of the vindictive campaign against us, and in the 17 months since the voters of Iowa removed us from the Iowa Supreme Court for our decision in that case. Your love and friendship remind me every day that the most important things in life are not position or power. They are the people in one's life. And because of you, my life is filled with happiness. I mentioned that this honor was unexpected. It was unexpected because when we cast our votes in Varnum, we weren't thinking about being courageous. We knew that our decision would be unpopular with many people. And as David said, we even knew in the back of our minds that we could lose our jobs because of our votes in that case. But we took an oath of office in which we promised to uphold the Iowa Constitution without fear, favor, or hope of reward. And that is what we did.
Iowans voted to retain all 70 judges and 4 Iowa Supreme Court justices last night.
Conservatives had targeted Justice David Wiggins for his decision to legalize same-sex marriage, but 54% voted to retain him. News Channel 8's Laura Nichols has reaction.
At their downtown Des Moines office late Tuesday night, leaders of the Iowa State Bar Association applauded Iowans for voting to retain Justice David Wiggins.
Iowans have affirmed their support for and confidence in Iowa's merit system of selecting judges.
At a watch party in Grimes, the group that worked hard to unseat Wiggins voiced its disappointment.
I said right from the beginning that this would be an uphill battle. And the reason it's an uphill battle, the coach in me says we're asking Iowans to win the state championship again.
In 2010, 3 Supreme Court justices were ousted after their part in the unanimous decision to legalize same-sex marriage. This election, Justice Wiggins, who was also part of that decision, was up for retention.
Judge Wiggins legislated from the bench, executed from the bench, and attempted to amend the Constitution from the bench.
The Christian conservative group, the Family Leader, set out on a 17-day bus tour campaign, urging Iowans to vote no Wiggins on Election Day.
I think what they did was spread a good deal of misinformation about the role of the courts, about the job that Iowa's judges and justices do every day.
In the end, Iowans voted to keep Justice Wiggins on Iowa's Supreme Court bench.
We sincerely hope that tonight's vote will bring an end to the harmful and ill-conceived efforts we saw this year to influence the retention process.
At the end of the day, I think we still send a very clear message. Another very clear message to Wiggins, to the Iowa State Bar Association.
Laura Nichols, KCCI News Channel 8, Iowa's news leader.
All righty. Mark, why don't you start?
All right. Thank you, Tom. Thanks, everyone, for coming. This is really great. I was wondering if anyone would come on Father's Day, and I'm just delighted to see that you all have come. Tom and I have talked about this a lot with ourselves, and so we could have asked one another questions, and we would have been okay. But this is just wonderful. Thank you, Don and Jen, for coming. And also, Janelle, thank you so much for the kind introduction. I want everyone to know that Janelle was probably our liveliest interview, or one of the liveliest interviews. After we got done, we said, and we started writing things, we'd say, can we really say that? So, but that's all right. We dealt with that a lot anyway. It's nice to see some old friends back from when we were working, and at the Register. We appreciate that. Tom and I, this book, we've been at this for 3 years now, I think, haven't we, Tom? Didn't we start about 3 years ago?
April 2012.
And I remember exactly the day you came. We were in the newsroom, and we started. Tom said, what about this book? Would you like? You want to be a part of this? And I said, yeah. But at the time, one of our old bosses came up to us and wondered if we were having a union meeting here. And so, but anyway, it was. Excuse me.
While he's turning that off, it came during the period when Jeanette had offered.
It was Vanderplatz. I just told him.
Had offered us old guys the opportunity to leave the paper by walking, what I call walking to shore. They were giving us a buyout. I had been talking to Justice Cady almost from the time of the decision. He had been the keynote speaker at my son's law school graduation here at the University of Iowa. And I had walked up to him and said, I think we need to do a book, or we need to write a lot more about the decision. And that started a sort of a 3-year period where I kept on trying to convince him to talk about it in an in-depth way. Mark and I have known Justice Cady a long time, and he came up to me and said, Cady wants to do the book now. And I said, you want to be a part of it? And the reason I did it was very selfish. Marc Hansen is one of the best writers in the United States, and I wanted him to help me tell the story. Go ahead.
Well, the reason I brought up Janelle's salty language is because every time Tom and I would finish an interview, one of us would look at the other one and say, well, this is unbelievable. This is a great story. And then the other one automatically would say, we just can't mess this up. And I'm not quoting myself exactly the way you can imagine. But, so yeah, and we did it for a variety of reasons. One that I think is important for a writer is this is an absolutely wonderful underdog wins story. I mean, it was a group of plaintiffs who came basically out of nowhere. No one thought they had much of a chance. They had to overcome all kinds of things. It's actually, for two journalists, it was just a magnificent opportunity to tell a great story. And what I think I'll do now is I'm going to read a little bit. And I think to understand where this book, how this book came about, nobody really said it better than Michael Gartner in our foreword. And Michael Gartner was, I don't know if everyone knows who he was. He's the owner of the Iowa Cubs right now. But he's worn so many hats. He was the president of NBC News. He was our editor. He was all kinds. I mean, he's done everything in journalism, just about. And so we asked him, because he knew us, and if he would write our foreword for us. And he did. And I think it's just an absolutely perfect explanation of what we were trying to do. I won't read the whole thing, but I think it's really good. They seemed an unlikely mix of couples in an unlikely place to be pioneers in the march toward gay marriage in America. There were 6 couples. Some were older, some younger. Some had children, some had none. There were 3 male couples, 3 female. They seemed the most ordinary of people from the most ordinary of towns and the most ordinary of states. In fact, though, they were extraordinary people in an extraordinary state. For equality, for fairness, for dignity, and especially for love, the 12 men and women were willing to take their private lives public. And they did so in a state whose Supreme Court has for 175 years routinely upheld the ideas of fairness and of liberty and of equality, usually decades before the Supreme Court of the United States found its way to similar rulings. As it turned out, the 6 couples were in the right place at the right time. But the story of how Iowa, the very heart of the heartland, became just the 3rd state after Massachusetts and Connecticut to recognize that all men and women were equal and thus could marry whomever they chose is a story about far more than 6 gay couples and 7 honorable justices. It is a story of politicians wrestling with their consciences and sometimes the consciences losing, and of lawyers wrestling with the law. It is a story of legal strategies and political showdowns. It is a story of important people who stood up and equally important ones who ducked down. And it is a story of little children fiercely wanting what their schoolmates had, married parents. Reporters Witosky and Hansen are Iowans who, like many Iowans, watched with interest but not surprise as the case of Varnum versus Breen unfolded in the courts in Des Moines. Recently retired from the Des Moines Register, they resolved to take a long look at how the case arose, how it played out, how it was decided, and how it affected the state and some of its people. The result is this book. Varnum was an important decision, and this is an important book. Years from now, when gay marriage is routine across America, people will wonder how it was that Iowa was a leader, how it was that the opponents were outmaneuvered in the legislature, and how it was that 3 Supreme Court justices lost their job in an aftermath that was far more contentious than the case itself. Who are the people that made it happen? The lawyers, the politicians, the judges, the couples, and the partisans who battled it out in judicial elections after the fact. The answers are all on these pages. Because of their backgrounds as knowledgeable Iowans and as fair and accurate reporters, Hansen and Witosky were able to get access to virtually every person with a voice in the story. Chief Justice Marcia Turnus walked them through the process at the Supreme Court, and Justice Mark Cady, who wrote the Varnum decision, talked them through the process of writing the decision. Lawyers on both sides, politicians of every stripe, and of course, the couples and some of their children, told how they came to be involved and how their views evolved. No voice is missing. Iowa became a state in 1846. The next year, it adopted its motto, "Our liberties we prize and our rights we will maintain." The Varnum case is a further guarantee of those liberties, a further maintenance of those rights. And this book by Witosky and Hansen explains how it all came about. I think that's a really good explanation. I have another little bit I'm going to read. It's from the first chapter, and it's not long, but it's about the Barbarowskis, and they were so important in this book. I mean, they just gave us their home, basically, for several hours at a time. And so it's this chapter 1, it's called Injured Child. As she ate breakfast before kindergarten, 5-year-old McKinley Barbarowski learned a terrible truth about her parents. The conversation was weekday morning matter-of-fact. McKinley, by all appearances, was off in her own little world, paying scant attention to the grown-ups at the table. Jen Barbarowski was telling her longtime partner, Don Barbarowski, about a conversation that night before with another nurse in the University of Iowa Hospital's neonatal unit. The co-worker was stunned to learn that Jen and Don weren't married and that same-sex marriage was prohibited in Iowa. As McKinley's 2 moms quickly discovered, McKinley was paying close attention. "You're not married?" she cried out, huge tears rolling down her cheeks. The very notion was absurd. How could they not be married? Jen was Mommy and Don was Mima. They were her parents. They'd always been her parents. But the answer was no, not yet, not in Iowa. Back in Iowa, McKinley Barbarowski was too young to understand the stakes. She wanted only what most of the other kids had. It would not be long before the United States Supreme Court shared her concerns. In the nation's slow-simmering same-sex marriage debate, much ink was spilled and energy expelled, conjecturing that children were somehow imperiled by living in the homes of same-sex couples. Official acknowledgement of their mere existence would take a long time. It would come 10 years later in the Supreme Court of the United States as the justices delicately probed the constitutionality of California's ban on same-sex marriage. In the oral argument, Justice Anthony Kennedy noted evidence that some 40,000 children lived in California with same-sex parents. Those children, Kennedy added, want their parents to have full recognition and full status. Denying children such recognition, he said, could result in, quote, an immediate legal injury, and that's the voice of these children, end quote. It was a flesh and blood moment in a case that hinged on technical questions. Who had the right to litigate the California ban in court? Exactly who was injured here? Addressing the lawyers seeking to uphold the ban, Kennedy said, "The voice of the children is important in this case, don't you think?" It would appear so. That voice, judging by the numbers, rings out across the country. When Gary Gates, a demographer at the UCLA Law School, looked into 2008 statistics for the New York Times, he found some 250,000 children under age 18 being reared by 116,000 same-sex couples. 5 years earlier, McKinley's voice at the kitchen table was filled with pain. Something was wrong with her family. Something was missing. Her parents tried to explain how the law wouldn't let them marry, but their words brought no solace. "Does that mean you're splitting up?" McKinley said. "No, not at all," came the answer. "We're the same strong family we've been and always will be. We're married in our hearts." The look on McKinley's face that morning reminded Dawn and Jen Bobrowski what they already knew, what the majority of Americans would someday come to accept. Married in their hearts was not enough. So I think I'll turn it over to Tom here. I know he's got a few things to say and a few things to read before we're going to open it up, probably. Yes.
And Jen and Dawn are going to ask them a couple questions and get a conversation going here. You know, today being Father's Day, the book, when you strip all the words away, a lot of the words away, is about families. And whether it was McKinley asking her mothers why they weren't married, whether it was Jason and Chuck Swaggerty Morgan up in Sioux City wanting to adopt 4 children who were basically orphans, but they wanted to be married for them, whether it was Dave Twombly and Larry Hope wanting to be married as they were wanting to form a family as they entered their later days. Equal before the law is a story about what defines a family and how Iowans treat families. There are other connections. Whether it was the coincidence of District Court Judge Jeff Neary, who handled the first case, it was a divorce case up in Sioux City that he granted somewhat surprisingly, somewhat unknowingly, he says. He attended the same judge's school with District Court Bob Hansen, who was the lower court judge who made the decision on the Varnum case in Polk County. Whether it was Janelle Reddick challenging the status quo with a fervor that has made her a Johnson County supervisor, and the support that she got from Robin, her wife, or just how 7 strong-willed justices could sit down in a room 4 times and go through that opinion word by word and not try to kill each other before it was over. All of that is what the book is about, and it's about Iowans who did what they believed was the right thing to do, despite the consequences. And that is an unusual story. It is an underdog story. As 2 guys who wrote a lot of sports, that was a kind of story that just absolutely mandated that we had to write it. It's one of those things that, as we've gotten out some, and we've just started, I've been surprised by the emotion that the issue and the book still engenders in a lot of folks. We've been thanked by gays and lesbians constantly. I even got kissed on the cheek in a bar the other day in Des Moines.
But that happens all the time.
Yeah, right. But also, you know, but their families and their acquaintances. We, at the Capital City Pride, we had 3 young men from Ireland who were working up at Camp Sunnyside with disabled children. They had just been in the United States right after the vote in Ireland, and they were asking us, what's going to happen next? You know, here, you guys have had it for a long time. And we went on to just talk about how there will be some pushback and all that, but before it's all over, it's not going to make much difference to anybody. Overall, there's a sense of accomplishment, I think, of getting to share in the recognition of being able to marry the person of your choice. It will remain controversial. Obviously, the Supreme Court decision is coming down, and we're already hearing some pushback in terms of religious liberty, looking for ways to circumvent or ignore the law if it goes that way. Well, we've gone through all of that in Iowa. I think having gone through the retention election, as difficult as it was for the 3 justices, it made Iowa think about what Iowa was about. And I think 2 years later, there really was a sense of buyer's remorse. It didn't hurt that 350,000 more people voted in the election than in 2012 than they did in 2010. And 300,000 of them voted to retain David Wiggins. But I also think it was Iowa's ability to learn and to talk and to make up its mind that that decision has a very salutary effect in this state and no adverse effect. I'm going to read a couple portions because it's a couple of these instances I think sort of highlight the kind of work and dedication some people have had on this issue. And the first one has to do with the hearing at the Polk County Courthouse on the day of the initial hearing. Janelle Reddick and Robin Butler weren't going to miss this after all that they had been through. The two, along with friends and allies, had long battled for this chance to stand up for the right to marry. They had been leaders in the successful battle nearly 3 years earlier to keep the constitutional amendment restricting marriage to heterosexual couples off the ballot. Then, with the help of Camilla Taylor and her staff, Reddick and Butler had spent a substantial amount of time holding meetings, conferences, and seminars around the state to explain to Iowans and educate them about why gays and lesbians wanted to marry. The efforts had helped to lobby state residents to think about accepting marriage equality. But the two also knew it would take years to overcome the opposition without a court victory. As they walked into Judge Robert Hansen's courtroom on May 4th, 2007, they waved hello to their Iowa City friends, Jen and Don Barbarowski. Sharon Millero was there, as well as Camilla Taylor, the legal leader of the effort. Reddick couldn't help but laugh to herself as she remembered the first time she met Taylor 2 years earlier. The Lambda legal attorney had agreed to participate on a panel about same-sex marriage at the University of Iowa. Part of her purpose was to explain why it was an important issue in legal terms, but she was also there to scope out the reaction she might get and meet some of the individuals on the front lines of the struggle, whom she had spoken to over the phone. Back then, Reddick and Butler had agreed to meet Taylor at a downtown hotel and walk to where the panel would take place on the Iowa campus. As they strolled through the downtown mall area, the lawyer noticed a series of small statues standing outside various businesses. "What's with the eagle?" Taylor asked. Reddick laughed. "That's no eagle. It's Herky the Hawk, the university's athletic mascot. Everyone in the state knows that." While she explained, she realized a few lessons were in order. Quote, "This is never going to work," Reddick thought. "Here's this New York lawyer in her high heels and power suit. She's got a lot to learn about Iowa." And then...
It's a funny book, too.
It is a funny book. We do have some funny scenes. And then I think, to start off, and then we'll get to talk to Jen and Dawn, but I think knowing how the court came to its decision is important. It is something that the court doesn't generally do. We were able to talk them into it because of the significance of the ruling. And most of them, with the exception of Justice Hecht and Apple, who just decided they just didn't want to talk to us.
They did buy some books.
But they did buy books, they did.
So we forgive them.
Yeah,
now.
we do that. They told us the story about what happened, and I think it adds a lot of authenticity to the book. With oral arguments completed, the court members adjourned to the inner sanctum. Justice Cady began the discussion. A soft-spoken 58-year-old appointed by Republican Governor Terry Branstad, Cady would also write the opinion. It would be a 4-month project. Skeptics assumed he drew the assignment because Varnum was sure to be explosive. Since he would not face a retention vote until 2016, he was considered least vulnerable. And because he had been appointed by a Republican governor, his voice might carry more weight with conservatives. The theory was news to Katie, who actually earned his place on the hot seat by winning a raffle, or, as some said at the time, losing it. In fact, the assignment had been made weeks earlier when Turnus and her administrative assistant, Tamara Barrett, had arranged a double drawing to make it as fair as possible. Slips of paper numbered 1 through 7 were placed in a black cloth bag. The first drawing would determine the order in which the justices pulled the names of 7 cases. The order was based on seniority: Turnus, Katie, Michael Strite, David Wiggins, Darrell Hecht, Brand Apple, and David Baker. All cases are important, of course. Isn't that what you're supposed to say? Yet only one had the potential to rip the court and the state into two, changing both forever. And each member of the court knew which case that was. The room fell silent as Turnus drew first. Katie, next in seniority, reached in and grasped slip number 3. On it went until each justice had a number. Then came the drawing with the names of the cases. Turnus walked around the conference table to each justice, who then drew out a case. When it was Katie's turn, he reached in, looked down, and there it was. Turnus remembers hearing him say, Varnum v. Breen. At first, not having paid much attention to the names, he didn't make the connection. As others scanned their colleagues' face for clues, the light came on. He got it, Strike said with a laugh. Turnus, standing over his shoulder, concurred. Yes, she said, that's the case. But where would he go with it? The answer was obvious. Wherever the research led him. After months of reading and note-taking, and finally absorbing a morning of oral arguments, it was up to Katie to provide a brief analysis and explain to his peers how they should decide Varnum v. Breen. The room fell quiet. The mood was somber and serious. Since the double drawing, the justices had barely mentioned the case to one another, much less discussed its merits. How would Iowa's High Court respond to a lower court decision? They were about to find out. Now, starting with Katie, each member of the court disclosed for the first time his or her viewpoint on one of the most contentious issues of the day. Quote, we should affirm, Katie said softly, citing the Iowa Constitution's equal protection guarantee, which, in his mind, clearly prohibited limiting civil marriage to a man and a woman. Next, each justice was given the chance to respond. First up was Hecht, who agreed with Katie's assessment. Then came the rest of the dominoes: Strite, Baker, Wiggins, Turnus, Apple. All concurred on the equal protection analysis. Just as Katie had hoped, the plaintiff's argument would be unanimously upheld as long as he could write an opinion that held everyone together. This decision he thought was too controversial, too volatile for anything less. When it came to Varnum, he strongly believed the court should speak in one voice. As one justice after another weighed in, Strite could almost feel a sigh of relief spreading through the room. When it was over, the court members pushed back from the table and silently let the moment sink in. They all knew immediately something unusual had happened. The first unanimous decision by a court declaring unconstitutional a law prohibiting same-sex marriage. Massachusetts High Court had been 4-3 in 2003. So had Connecticut and California's high courts in 2008. California voters had overturned the decision with Proposition 8, which meant Iowa would be just the 3rd state in the Union and the first in America's heartland to permit same-sex couples to marry.
That's good stuff. That's good stuff.
I have to admit, when I read some of this, I ask myself, who wrote this? Really? Anyway, we do have some questions, and we'd like Jen and Dawn to...
Does everyone know Jen and Dawn?
Everybody know Jen and Dawn? They...
Nobody can tell them apart.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
When we talked to, just as way of introduction, when we interviewed Camilla Taylor, and I think it was before we talked with you guys, I'm not sure. And when I talked about emotion, when Camilla started talking about McKinley, she started to cry. She did.
In our interview.
Yeah, during our interview. She said, I can't help it. I don't know why. And we talked about it. She said, I haven't talked about this in a long time, and when I think about McKinley as the heart and soul of the case, why we did this, why it was important. And she got very, very emotional about it. And Jen and Dawn have played a huge role in all of this. And I guess the first question we'd like to just start talking about is, okay, why? Why did you do this? It's not the easiest decision in the world, obviously.
You know, frankly, it was for us. I think, you know, from the very beginning of our relationship, we've always, every measure that we could take to show that we were a family to the rest of the world, we did. I mean, we changed our names. That was all we had at the time. You know, and then when we moved out to San Francisco, that was when they the first time that they had domestic partnerships that you could register for. So we were there on that first day at City Hall, able to do that. And we've just sort of had a lucky series of being in the right place at the right time and making the best of the situations, always choosing where to live based on the best environment for us and then for our kids really is what it's driven. So this was an opportunity that we knew we needed and that, you know, everybody needs. I mean, it benefits everyone, not just even gays and lesbians. Just equality across the board is what we need.
And then we did it also for our kids. We wanted to show our kids, if this is something you believe in, you need to actually do something to get there. And so it was really important that they got that message that you've got to stand up and try and make the world a better place. And I think they've both come away from everything with that attitude. A combination of that and the whole fact that the whole next generation, you know, I love that our kids see the world very differently than we saw it when we were their age. It's changing very rapidly into a much better place.
Yeah, as a kid, I mean, there was no even hope of marriage
when we were kids.
I mean, even when we got together.
Yes.
I mean, this is our 25th year together, and when we first got together, I mean, there was nothing. And, you know, you don't, as a gay kid, you know, it's like you have friends that are dreaming about getting married when they grow up or, you know, what these things are going to be. And that just wasn't there. And now to see kids who, and our own kids, even though that, you know, they know that it wasn't there from the beginning, but they know that that's an option now. It's huge.
It was interesting because in past cases, the plaintiffs did not want to get children involved in that because they thought, whenever you mention children, that was just a negative. How could you do this to these children? This won't be a normal life for them. But in this case, it was turned around. And I thought, and McKinley was, I mean, whether she knew it or not, that she was on view. And she did, and again, she did everything. She took notes, I guess, and she did everything that she was supposed to do. And it was, for someone that young, I thought it was just an amazing.
Well, I remember, in fact, when our first interviews with Jen and Dawn, McKinley was always there with her notebook just to make sure that her folks got it right. A lot of discussion about the inclusion of children and plaintiffs has centered on how unusual it was. And this is really how unusual it was. McKinley and Bree and Ingrid and Reva's child were the first co-plaintiffs ever in a lawsuit on marriage equality. There was a huge debate among the lawyers as to whether or not they should do that. A lot of lawyers outside of Lambda really questioned it. And Camilla and Ken Upton, another lawyer for Lambda, and Denny Johnson. And I do think Denny Johnson had a lot of influence, because when they went to Denny Johnson, who was going to do the arguing before Judge Hansen, and in front of the Supreme Court. He's a former Solicitor General. He'd been an Iowa lawyer forever, very, very successful. He said, "This absolutely, we have to do this because it allows us to tell the story that needs to be told."
It was really interesting. McKinley had a part about how she would stare at Turnus, she called it a Jedi mind game, to get into her head so that she would make the right decision. So I asked Turnus, I said, "Did you know that McKinley was staring at you?" And she said, I make it a point never to look at anyone outside the court in the audience because I don't want anything to sway me. But she got swayed anyways.
Yeah. Well, and at the end, and in fact, we talked to Denny at length about his argument in front of the Supreme Court, and he had several moot court, tests. Lawyers, in a situation like this, they go through a lot of preparation. They want other lawyers to throw every nasty, stinky question that they can think of at them and demand answers right away, and that's how they practice. So, and the one thing that Denny was trying to get in was the last story that he told to the Supreme Court was about Jen and Dawn trying to find a preschool, I think it was, for McKinley, and they had gone to one. They were just about ready to write the check until they asked one question: would McKinley be able to participate in all the events, all the functions, that type of thing? And whoever it was that they were talking to said no, she will not be able to participate in the family week events because of you guys. Well, that obviously ended that relationship real quick there, and Denny Johnson said, "This is what this case is about." And he felt really happy and glad that he got that last story. And so the inclusion of children in this story, and then you had Anthony Kennedy in the Prop 8 case mentioning it, it changed the argument. It really did.
But it must have been hard for you to make that decision that she would play such a...
Well,
she was up to the
I was going to say,
task.
if you've met McKinley, she's happy to talk.
Yeah.
I remember when Camilla had called us to ask, and it was after the New York case when they had ruled really that heterosexuals needed the right to marry because they could accidentally become pregnant, and so the kids needed to be able to have parents, and so I think that's really what also got them, the light switch.
I remember Camilla telling me just how angry they were. I mean, when you think about that argument, think about the argument.
It's ridiculous.
Right, that heterosexuals can be and often are irresponsible when it comes to procreation. And gays and lesbians have to plan this all out, adoption or whatever, right? And so we're going to give them the benefit of being married, and we're not. It makes no sense when you really think it's because heterosexuals are irresponsible that we have marriage.
Yes, that was
Essentially, that's what the argument is. And I know it really angered them and all of that, and I think that helped precipitate it. But.
So she called and asked, what we would think about that, and they wanted to make sure to give us time to think about it, and because it could have a lot of ramifications, and we both, it was really automatic that yes, because that's what we're fighting for, really, is the family. So if that's what will help, and not as a pawn, but this is our family, and this is why, if this is going to help us get there, people need to see that it affects children.
And she was coming from a place that she had family support, extended family support, a school that was supportive, so she and has been part of this community. As Janelle said, she's run around every event in Iowa City since she was 3. So she had a core community here, so that she had the support. So we didn't feel like we were putting her at risk. She had adequate support.
The only thing that made us a little nervous is because we had adopted our younger daughter, and when we had started the case, when we started talking with them, we were working through the foster to adopt program, and so that was the one thing that gave us pause. And she was so young at this point. She doesn't quite remember all of this part.
Okay. Any kind of repercussions at all afterward? Anything?
Towards the kids, no. They really have not had any. I mean, and we do ask them periodically.
They've gotten some, but it's it's
very rarely. Yeah, it's been very positive. It's interesting. They've almost connected with some of their teachers a little bit more so, because not all their peers. I mean, kids are kids, and they're not thinking about what's in the newspaper. They're doing their own thing, but teachers will be aware of the case and talk to the kids, and that's been cool. They've got a lot of positives in that way.
There was a new social studies book they just got, the textbook, and a teacher opened it up and it had a picture of McKinley in it.
Well, that's good. That should help them identify her in class.
There you go, exactly.
I think if folks have questions, we'd be more than happy to answer. We just ask that you come to the microphone, because this is being televised and is going to be streamed soon. So please, any questions that you have, we'd be more than happy to answer them. Or statements.
Or should I pass the microphone around? Would that be easier? Well, I wanted to also talk about some of the other plaintiff couples, and we had kind of a similar session with the two Des Moines, Larry and David, and one of the things that was such a mix of couples, I thought, and it was interesting to kind of compare what David and Larry had gone through. I mean, they were by far the oldest plaintiff couples by 20 years, I think, and they kind of it was a great cast, because they really represented the old guard that really had to go through a lot more. They were teachers, and they didn't dare say that they were teachers, and so they basically, it was just a totally different time, and it was really interesting. Did you talk to them about what they had to go through, or was it, or were there any stories, the couple stories that kind of caught your eye? Or
I think we did more talking of just kind of friends getting together across the state. Mm-hmm. Since we're all walking similar steps. I mean, we learned everyone's kind of basic stories initially, but it's old friends getting together at this point. So, I mean, it's always fun seeing all of them. And
well, Denny said in the book, when he was first introduced, there was one meeting where someone said, when did you know and how did you know, and there was sort of a sharing of all of that. And I'm not exactly, I can't quite remember who said it. Well, I sort of knew, because I always was trying to wear my dad's ties. Was that Reva or somebody like that?
Oh, I don't remember that.
Well, anyway, it's just, one of those.
We did have some of those talks, where because we would have to all convene in Des Moines to meet and talk about the case, or what the next step was, and those aspects. And so, since we were from all over the state, we would spend the night most of the, for some of the meetings, and it was nice to be able to just kind of sit around and talk about those things. Sure. But I was really, even having lived through the experience, we were a bit apprehensive as well about doing interviews and talking about it, and until Camilla and Lisa told us it was okay. But I found it a very compelling read and very enjoyable. It is humorous, and I learned so much about the case, even having gone through it, that I wouldn't have known otherwise, and it really helped put pieces together, and it was really a unique way to look through all these different perspectives and how different people approached it, and it really was enlightening.
Oh, thanks. We really had great access to everyone, and we were able to get in and get really inside it and tell the story, and it was one of the, I think, most worthwhile assignments I've ever had. I don't know about you. It was just getting to know everyone.
No doubt about that.
I mean, we were like inside the case, and I thought the plaintiffs, most of them, and the court was, Katie was just, anytime we had a question, he'd make time for us. Wiggins, on the other hand, was not quite. I remember we did a story in the paper, this kind of, and we were talking about it, and he said, "You got that all wrong." I said, "What?" And I said, "Well, would you mind telling me how we got it all wrong?" "No, I never talk about that." So I finally went to Katie. I was a little upset about that, so I went to Katie and I said, "Hey, Wiggins said we got this all wrong." And he said, "That's Wiggins."
You have a question, sir?
I do. I'm wondering if you had a chance in preparing for this to talk with the opposing counsel, whether or not you got their side of the story or their reaction. I'm just interested in how they
Yeah, it's a good question.
We had a long talk with Roger Kuhl, who was the assistant Polk County attorney who handled the case, and with his boss, Mike O'Meara. Mike is an interesting fellow. He's a former Catholic priest, married a former nun, and they are very, very good guys. They really are. They sat down with us for 3 hours.
Now, that would have been a story if it was a present nun.
Yeah. And essentially, they took us step by step through their position, and it was one of those difficult cases that they had, in that they knew that under a constitutional challenge, they were probably going to have to provide a substantive reason, governmental reason, to keep the restriction to a man and a woman. That wasn't easy by any stretch of the imagination, because there really isn't one, and that's what the courts are deciding. Okay, and I'm not, being advocating a position here. If you read all of these decisions, and I'll quote one other case, Judge Richard Posner in the 7th Circuit. He was appointed by President Reagan. He has been a conservative icon, an icon of the conservative legal right for a long, long time. And in fact, he wrote a book in book review in 1998, saying that the last thing the Supreme Court should do should be to grant marriage equality. That's what he wrote in 1998. In 2014, after being appointed to the panel that heard the challenges of the Wisconsin and Indiana law, he turned around an opinion in 2 weeks that basically said the reasons provided to us by Wisconsin and Indiana are so full of holes that it doesn't hold water. And essentially, that was the problem that Roger Kuhl and Mike O'Meara had. Their expert witnesses weren't really particularly expert witnesses in the specific areas. They had a couple, and even those experts whose testimony was submitted on the question of are children harmed by being in a same-sex couple, they basically said there's no real evidence to indicate that that's true. Now, granted, it's early, that type of thing, but when you're a judge, you got to make a decision based on what the facts are. They made a very, very, very good effort. There's a section in the book where Roger has been interviewing at depositions and taking depositions along with the plaintiff's lawyers, and he said at one time he thought, geez, why can't the Iowa legislature sit down and listen to these folks and figure out something instead of us having to go through all of this? It didn't work out that way. But they were quite good with us, and in fact, we invited them to our lunch party. They showed up, so it was a good time had by all.
We also talked to Bob Vanderplatz. Did you?
Yeah, go ahead.
And he wasn't at our lunch party, but he would have been invited. We should have invited him. I don't know why. Well, we did talk to him, and we talked to him for what, about an hour and a half? And we also, at the end, we sent his office some facts that we wanted fact-checked. And his assistant said, wow, I didn't know we were going to get all these. So I don't think, we didn't hear anything that was negative or anything that we'd had wrong. So,
well, and the other part of this is, I think, is that the issue here, and this does relate to what's going to be coming down from the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court, is that you're going to have a pushback like Iowa had. But I think over time, people, again, are going to conclude, well, the last poll that I've seen in Iowa, the Iowa poll, said 1/3 supports same-sex marriage equality, 1/3 opposes it, and the other third, no, they just don't care. And so it's been very, very quiet. There was a constitutional amendment proposal introduced in this last legislature in the Iowa House. They didn't even bring it up. They didn't even send it to, they sent it to a committee. It never came out of committee. And Bob and Family Leader has decided not to force the Republican presidential candidates to sign their oath that they will oppose same-sex marriage on pain of death or whatever it is. They're not even doing that. It's not a big step. They're not changing their mind. They're going to continue to advocate it. But the temperature here in this state is very, very low when it comes to this. And I think eventually it's going to, unlike the predictions that it's going to be a constant battle, like the battle over Roe v. Wade, I think this one is going to sort of just peter out and wane, and life will go on, and everything will be pretty much like it should be.
I think even with the ruling, it's going to go on for a little further, because
it's going to go on for a while.
Even when we won here, we still had to go back to court again to have both parents be on a death certificate, to have both parents be on a birth certificate, things that different sex couples, take for granted when they're married and traveling and all those things. I mean, so I think, hearing all of the pushback nationally as well, that they are, you have people that are against it. I don't think it's just sort of, it's released, it's done, we're good to go.
I agree. I absolutely agree. I mean, the thing is, in those states that want to continue to fight it, they're going to fight it every step of the way. But, well, like they tried here in Iowa. I mean, and it's all ended up as, but each decision stems from Varnum, and so far there hasn't been any adverse rulings in terms of birth certificates and death certificates and all that type of thing. It's part of the process, and people should expect that.
Thank you.
They really should. Hi.
Hi. We got here a little late. I'm sorry. Maybe you already answered this. This sounds like a great movie. No?
Yeah, well, you know what?
Yes.
When I was doing my side of the writing, I kept thinking, wow, this is a great movie scene. I really did. So
if you know anybody that's in that business, let us know, and we'll send them a copy of the book.
Well, my wife has a friend who knows Peter Hedges, so I don't know. That would be great.
It's intrigue, it's the underdog, it's wonderful, fabulous story.
Thank you.
Do you have another book in mind? The next book?
Do we have another book in mind? Well, it's we're kicking around some ideas, and Mark is finishing up a book on his own on the gymnastics coach in Des Moines.
Liang Chao.
You want to talk a little bit about it?
Yeah, I can. I won't talk too much, but yeah, we've been working on this for a while, and he's got another. He was the coach of Shawn Johnson, and Gabby Douglas, and now he's got at least one more who might be in line for another Olympic shot. So, and it's a great story about this. In fact, he came to the University of Iowa because his Aunt Woos was getting her doctorate here, and said, "You got to come to Iowa." He wanted to get out and explore the world, so she said, "Come here, and you'll do really well." And so he came here and became an assistant to the men's team. And he did that for about 3 years. Then he and his wife came over, and then he decided that he wanted to get his own business. So he talked to some people, and he said, "You should go out to West Des Moines. That's where all the little girls and their young parents are and everything." And so he went out there, and he's built this fantastic dynasty almost. It's like he is considered the best gymnastics coach in the world by many. So that's what we're doing. But now back to the subject at hand.
I just wonder, we just have gone through 8 years where a lot of people my age, your age, thought we would never have a black president in our lifetimes. And now this has happened. What happened in those intervening, I mean, this doesn't have anything to do with the black president, but what happened to change Posner's mind, to change the dynamics? I sure never thought this stuff would happen. That there would be, I mean, across the country, gay people can marry.
Right. Well, the interesting thing about Posner in that book review piece, he basically said they've got the folks pushing for marriage equality have a really, really good legal case. They really do. His problem was that at the level of it, there was no acceptance of it whatsoever. And his concern was you shouldn't be finding fundamental rights when a whole heck of a lot of people are against it. And in fact, and it is in the book, he writes about what a legal opinion that was going to sort of change that tide would have to say and what would have to be. And he also said it probably should come from a state court that is subject to election. Beginning to sound familiar? And he said it would have to deal with the religious question, right? The cultural questions, sociological questions. And my point about that is I think Barnum comes about as close to meeting that template as any of the opinions that I've read. Interestingly enough, public opinion polls started to change, show change toward that issue beginning in 2009. I don't think there's any doubt, well, there's very little doubt in my mind, that Iowa was a huge catalyst because it came from the heartland, it was completely unexpected, and it made people think. Mark?
I think the video, the guy on the video said it was a springboard. It was like dominoes almost, to mix my metaphors, but
well, there's a small connection between Iowa and the Prop 8 case as well, because for there was a Voices of the Children brief that was submitted for the case as well, that both Zach Walls and our daughter McKinley both submitted, were interviewed for, and through the Family Equality Council submitted briefs on those behalf. So when he was reading and talking about the Voices of the Children, we had a couple Iowans in there too. So that's a neat thing.
Yeah, and I do think I do think Iowa's role in all of this had a lot to do with that. And now, why it happened so quickly, I have no idea. Maybe it was because well, as Justice Streit told us, it was just obvious. And maybe that's what everybody started to figure out.
Oh, one of the plaintiffs in Prop 8 is an Iowan, one of the and University of Iowa graduate.
That's right.
And so our ties to that case are really important. My question has to do with what did it feel like to have dozens of people's trust in you? Because that's kind of how I felt. And then about the fact checking, you said Justice Wiggins said you got it all wrong. And I know of one fact checking where There was a disagreement of opinion about what had happened, but you asked us to tell you stories that now are almost 2 decades old in one case. And that's a long time for people to, you know, when we didn't record and videotape and everything. So talk about a little bit of the fact checking.
Yeah.
Our process was to interview and then do research. And we would go back and look at newspaper articles. We would, in a couple of occasions, I talked to a couple of friends of the folks that we were talking to, just to get a perspective on making sure that we had the right story. It was also about getting them to trust us, and that can be hard. I mean, that can be very hard. But we've been doing this for a long, long time, and I think our reputations as reporters preceded us, and I think it was one of those things where we would look at what was said, and then we would try to fit it into the context of the time, of that moment. And then it was also important for us to go back and ask,
And
do we have this straight?
You must have looked at the name on the, you know, the who was calling and said, "Oh no, he's calling again." I mean, I badgered you, I thought, a little bit, but.
We looked you guys up as sports writers.
Yeah, right. That's right.
In terms of the law, I couldn't think of anybody better to make sure what I was writing was correct than Justice Cady. And he was kind enough to make sure that I didn't make any horrible mistakes. And then I got Justice Wiggins the other day said, "Well, you didn't go to law school. If you were a law student, you'd have gotten a B. But since you didn't go, I'll give you the name. I'll give you the name." So it was very, very helpful to talk to, just to develop a relationship, to talk to you. I mean, the story about the disagreement over what happened had to do with Tom Vilsack and a meeting of I think Robin called it the tail between the legs meeting. It was over Governor Vilsack, well, then he was state senator, voting for the Iowa DOMA law in 1998. And as you might imagine, that didn't sit well with Janelle. And there was a bit of a blow-up at the Johnson County Courthouse on the night of the election. That was followed up a couple months later with a meeting here in Iowa City with Secretary Vilsack. Anyway, Janelle had said that he had used the term political cowardice in explaining his vote. When I asked, I contacted the secretary, I asked him about it. He said, "Oh no, I don't think I used that term." And he said, "We did have a nice long talk, but I don't think I did that." Well, I call it, this is just what you do with fact checking. I sent an email to Janelle with the quotes from Secretary Vilsack, and I get a response, "Give me an hour." All right, and so about 2 hours later, I get an email, and it was notes. Spontaneously taken notes at the meeting, dated by Robin. And there it was, in quotes, political cowardice. Wow. You know, you just have to decide who you're going to believe in this, and it's up to you. However, I did ask the secretary if you remember. I said, "Okay, fine. Why did you vote for the law?" And he said, "I don't remember voting for the law." And I played that. I've been teaching at Drake in a journalism class, and I just played the tapes for the kids just to get their response. And there were moans when they heard that. So that's how we did it. And
I was just going to mention, get back to Wiggins a little bit. It's funny because, you know, sometimes I don't know if he's joking or not, but he said, no, that's wrong, and and I would say, well, how's it wrong? And he said, I don't talk about that kind of thing. So afterwards, he calls me up and says, this is when we were published, he says, I just ordered 30 books. I'm going to pass them out to people who come visit the court. I said, well, you're going to erase all those incorrect facts that we had? But he has kind of a gruff exterior, but he was also very helpful.
I think we've exhausted everybody, and we do thank you for coming. We'll be here if you want us to sign a book, but we'd be more than happy to. Thank you for coming. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks.